September 4, 1945. Arctic Circle, Norway. The biting wind whipped across the desolate landscape, carving paths through the snowdrifts that swallowed the small, isolated weather station whole. Inside, Unteroffizier Sergeant Heinz Strunk shivered, though not entirely from the cold. A gnawing unease had taken root in his gut, a feeling as persistent and chilling as the Arctic gale. He adjusted the dials on the radio for what felt like the thousandth time that day. Static. Just static. For months now, only the hiss of empty airwaves had answered his calls. Once, the rhythmic pulse of signals from Berlin had been his lifeline, a constant reminder of the fatherland, of purpose, of the war that raged across Europe. Now silence. A deafening, unnerving silence that pressed in on him and the small crew stationed at this remote outpost. Strunk ran a gloved hand over his stubbled chin. 4 men. 4 souls stranded at the edge of the world. Their mission, once so vital to provide crucial weather data for the German war effort, now felt absurd, pointless. The war, what war? Had it ended? Had they won? Lost? The questions haunted him, swirling in his mind like the endless snowstorms outside. He glanced at the calendar hanging crookedly on the wall. September, 4 months. 4 months since the last garbled message had crackled through the speaker, something about advances on the Eastern Front, a desperate defense. 4 months of silence. Door creaked open and Private Johansen stumbled in, his face red from the cold, his eyes wide with a strange mixture of fear and something else. Unteroffizier, he stammered, brushing snow from his shoulders. I saw something, Strunk sighed. Johansen was prone to flights of fancy, prone to seeing things in the swirling snow and shadows. What is it this time, Johansen? Polar bears wearing Wehrmacht uniforms. Johansen shook his head vehemently. No, it was a ship on the horizon. Heading this way, Strunk frowned. Ships were rare in these waters, especially now. And why would one be heading towards their isolated station? He pushed himself up from the radio chair, his joints stiff from the cold and inactivity. Let's go see. They trudged through the snow towards the observation point, a small, exposed platform overlooking the frozen sea. The wind howled in their ears, stinging their faces. As they reached the edge, Strunk shielded his eyes with his hand and peered into the distance. There it was. A ship. A small vessel, its silhouette stark against the gray horizon. It was definitely heading towards them, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't a warship, it wasn't a supply vessel, it looked almost civilian. What do you think it is, Unteroffizier? Johansen asked, his voice barely audible above the wind. Strunk didn't answer. He didn't know. But he knew one thing, the silence was about to be broken, and he had a feeling it wouldn't be a welcome sound. The ship drew closer, its features becoming clearer. It was a small Norwegian fishing trawler flying a faded Norwegian flag. As it approached the shore, a small group of men could be seen on deck, bundled in thick coats and hats. Strunk turned to Johansen. Get Feldwebel Staff Sergeant Mueller and Jeffrader Corporal Weber. Tell them to bring their rifles. Something is not right. The Norwegians disembarked from the trawler, wading through the shallow, icy water towards the shore. They were armed, but not with military weapons. Hunting rifles, mostly. Their faces were grim, their eyes fixed on the German weather station. As they reached the shore, a tall man with a weathered face stepped forward. He spoke in heavily accented German. We know you are here. We know you have been here for a long time. The war is over. Strunk stared at the man, his mind reeling. The war was over. How could that be? But the man's face, the expressions of the other Norwegians, they weren't lying. What happened? Strunk stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The Norwegian sighed. Germany surrendered months ago. The Führer is dead. The Reich is finished. The words hit Strunk like a physical blow. The Führer dead. The Reich finished. Everything he had believed in, everything he had fought for gone. He looked back at the weather station, at the small, isolated building that had been his world for the past few years. A world that was now a relic of a war that no longer existed. We didn't know, Strunk said, his voice thick with emotion. We had no contact. The radio, the Norwegian nodded. We understand, but you must surrender. The war is over. Strunk hesitated. Surrender after all this time, after all the hardship and isolation. But what choice did he have? The war was over. There was nothing left to fight for. He turned to his men who had gathered behind him, their faces etched with confusion and disbelief. Lay down your weapons, he ordered, his voice heavy with resignation. The war is over. The German soldiers slowly lowered their rifles, the metallic clang echoing in the still Arctic air. They were prisoners, not of war but of time, lost in the vast, frozen wilderness, unaware that the world they knew had ceased to exist. The Norwegians approached, their expressions still grim but with a hint of pity in their eyes. They disarmed the German soldiers, herding them towards the trawler. As Strunk walked towards the ship, he noticed something on the ground, half buried in the snow, a small leather-bound book. He bent down and picked it up, brushing the snow off its cover. It was a diary. He opened the diary, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting. It was written in German but not in standard script. It was a code, a complex system of symbols and numbers. Curiosity piqued. Strunk shoved the diary into his pocket. He would decipher it later when he had time. For now, he had to focus on the present, on the reality of his surrender. As the trawler pulled away from the shore, heading back towards civilization, Strunk looked back at the weather station, at the lonely outpost that had been his prison for so long. He wondered what the future held. What would become of him and his men? What would they find when they returned to a world that had moved on without them? Back at the abandoned weather station, the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the whispers of a forgotten war. The snow continued to fall, slowly burying the outpost, erasing it from the landscape. But the diary remained, hidden in Strunk's pocket, a silent testament to a secret that was yet to be revealed. A secret that lay buried beneath the ice and snow, waiting to be uncovered. 2 weeks later. A prisoner of war camp in Scotland. Strunk sat alone on his bunk, the diary open in his lap. He had been working on deciphering the code for days, poring over the strange symbols and numbers, trying to make sense of them. It was slow going. The code was complex, deliberately obscure, but Strunk was persistent. He felt that the diary held some sort of key, some sort of explanation for the strange events that had led to their isolation and eventual surrender. He had managed to decipher some of the entries, fragments of information about weather patterns, radio frequencies, and something else. Something that didn't quite fit. References to strange experiments, to secret projects, to a mysterious Operation Nightingale. The more he deciphered, the more uneasy he became. This wasn't just a weather station. It was something else. Something far more sinister. One entry, dated just a few weeks before the radio contact was lost, caught his attention. It was a short, cryptic message. The package has arrived. Nightingale is ready to sing. The package, Nightingale. What did it all mean? Strunk closed the diary, his mind racing. He had a feeling that he was on the verge of uncovering something big, something dangerous. But he didn't know what it was. He looked around the crowded barracks at the faces of his fellow prisoners. They were all tired, defeated, longing for the war to be truly over. Would they believe him if he told them what he had found? Would they care? He decided to confide in Müller the Feldwebel. Müller was a seasoned soldier, a man of few words but one whom Strunk trusted implicitly. He found Müller sitting alone outside the barracks, smoking a cigarette. Strunk sat down beside him and quietly told him about the diary, about the code, about Operation Nightingale. Müller listened intently, his face expressionless. When Strunk finished, he took a long drag on his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "What do you think it means?" Strunk asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Müller shrugged. "I don't know, but it doesn't sound good. Secret experiments, that usually means trouble." "What should we do?" Strunk asked. Müller thought for a moment. "We need to find out more. We need to decipher the rest of the diary. But be careful, Strunk. If what you say is true, this could be dangerous." They continued to work on the diary in secret, piecing together the fragments of information, slowly unraveling the mystery of Operation Nightingale. They discovered that the weather station was not just a weather station. It was a research facility, conducting secret experiments on something. The diary never explicitly stated what the experiments were, but there were hints, references to biological agents, to genetic manipulation, to the creation of a super soldier. The more they learned, the more horrified they became. The Nazi regime had been experimenting with things that should never have been touched, things that could have unleashed unimaginable horrors upon the world. But what was Operation Nightingale? What was the package that had arrived just before the radio contact was lost? They found a clue in another entry, a reference to a nearby island, a small, uninhabited island a few miles from the weather station. The entry mentioned a hidden bunker on the island, a secret laboratory where the experiments were being conducted. Strunk and Mueller realized that the package must have been something that was transported to the island, something essential to the experiments. And Operation Nightingale must have been the code name for the final stage of the project. They knew they had to find out what was on that island. They had to find out what the Nazis had been up to. But how? They were prisoners of war. They had no way of getting to the island. Then, one day, Strunk overheard a conversation between two of the British guards. They were talking about a fishing trip, about how they were planning to take a boat out to a nearby island to fish for cod. Strunk realized that this was their chance. He approached the guards and offered to help them with their fishing trip. He claimed that he had been a fisherman before the war and that he knew all the best spots. The guards were skeptical at first, but Strunk was persuasive. He convinced them that he was just a harmless prisoner who wanted to escape the boredom of the camp. Finally, the guards agreed to let him come along. The next day, Strunk and Mueller, along with two British guards, set out on a small fishing boat towards the island. As they approached the shore, Strunk pointed to a secluded cove and told the guards that it was a good place to fish. The guards were distracted by the prospect of catching fish, so Strunk and Mueller were able to slip away unnoticed. They headed towards the center of the island, following the directions they had gleaned from the diary. They soon found the hidden bunker, concealed beneath a thick layer of vegetation. The entrance was a small steel door, almost invisible to the naked eye. Strunk tried the handle. It was locked. He and Mueller exchanged a look. They knew they had to get inside. Mueller pulled a small metal tool from his pocket. He had been a locksmith before the war, and he had managed to smuggle a few of his tools into the camp. He set to work on the lock, carefully manipulating the tumblers, his hands steady despite the tension. After a few minutes, the lock clicked open. They pushed open the steel door and stepped inside. The air inside the bunker was cold and damp, thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The bunker was dark, but Strunk had a small flashlight in his pocket. He switched it on, and the beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior of the bunker. They were in a small antechamber. In front of them was another door, this one made of thick, reinforced steel. It was sealed shut. Strunk shone the flashlight on the door. There was a small window in the center, covered with a metal grate. He peered through the window, trying to see what was on the other side. The view was obscured by dust and grime, but he could make out a faint light in the distance. He could also see something else, something that made his blood run cold. He saw figures, human figures, but they weren't moving. They were standing perfectly still, their faces blank, their eyes empty. They were like statues, frozen in time, and they were all wearing German uniforms. Strunk recoiled from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. What was going on here? What were these figures? He turned to Mueller, his face pale with fear. "We need to get out of here," he whispered. "Something is very wrong." But as they turned to leave, they heard a sound, a faint, mechanical whirring. It was coming from behind the steel door. The whirring grew louder, and then, with a loud clunk, the steel door began to open. Strunk and Mueller stood frozen in place, their eyes fixed on the opening door. As the door swung open, a blinding light flooded the antechamber, momentarily blinding them. As their eyes adjusted to the light, they saw what was on the other side. It was a laboratory. A large, sterile room filled with strange equipment, bubbling beakers, and flickering lights. And in the center of the room, standing behind a large glass enclosure, was a figure, a woman. She was wearing a white lab coat and her hair was pulled back in a tight bun. She was middle-aged with a stern face and piercing blue eyes. She looked at Strunk and Mueller, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Welcome," she said, her voice cold and emotionless. "I've been expecting you." Strunk stared at the woman, his mind reeling. Who was she? What was she doing here? "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman smiled again. "I am Dr. Elizabeth Schmidt, and this is Operation Nightingale." She gestured towards the glass enclosure. Inside, standing perfectly still, were the figures they had seen through the window, the German soldiers, but now they were moving, slowly, mechanically, like puppets on a string. Their eyes were still empty, their faces still blank, but they were alive, or something like alive. "What have you done to them?" Strunk asked, his voice filled with horror. Dr. Schmidt chuckled. I have perfected them. I have created the ultimate soldiers, soldiers who will never tire, who will never feel pain, who will never question orders, soldiers who will obey my every command. She raised her hand, and the figures inside the enclosure snapped to attention, their movements perfectly synchronized. Behold, Dr. Schmidt said, her eyes gleaming with fanaticism. The future of warfare. Strunk and Mueller stared in disbelief at the horrifying scene before them. The Nazis had created something truly monstrous, something that could change the course of history, but why? The war was over, Germany had surrendered. What was the point of all this? Why are you doing this? Strunk asked. The war is over. Dr. Schmidt's smile vanished. Her face hardened, her eyes filled with rage. The war is not over, she hissed. The Reich will rise again, and these soldiers will lead the way. She turned to the glass enclosure and spoke a single word, a command in German. Attack! The figures inside the enclosure surged forward, their movements suddenly swift and deadly. The glass shattered and the super soldiers poured out of the laboratory, heading towards Strunk and Mueller. Strunk and Mueller knew they were no match for these creatures. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched in every way. They turned and ran, desperately trying to escape the clutches of Dr. Schmidt's monstrous creations. They raced through the bunker, dodging the super soldiers, their hearts pounding in their chests. They reached the steel door that led back to the antechamber, but it was too late. The super soldiers were closing in, their eyes fixed on their prey. Strunk and Mueller knew they were trapped. They had nowhere left to run. As the super soldiers reached them, Strunk noticed something on the wall. A small metal box with a red button in the center. He didn't know what it was, but he knew he had to try something. He lunged towards the box and slammed his fist down on the red button. A deafening siren wailed through the bunker, and the lights flickered and died, plunging the bunker into darkness. Strunk and Mueller stumbled blindly through the darkness, trying to escape the super soldiers. They could hear the creatures moving around them, their heavy footsteps echoing in the confined space. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to shake. The bunker was collapsing. Dr. Schmidt screamed in fury as the walls began to crumble around them. The super soldiers were thrown to the ground, their mechanical movements disrupted by the tremors. Strunk and Mueller managed to find their way back to the steel door, just as the roof of the bunker began to cave in. They scrambled through the opening and out into the fresh air, just as the entire bunker collapsed behind them. They stood on the surface of the island, gasping for breath, watching as the earth swallowed the hidden laboratory hole. Dr. Schmidt and her super soldiers were buried alive, entombed beneath tons of rock and earth. The secret of Operation Nightingale was safe, buried along with its creators, but Strunk and Mueller knew that they could never forget what they had seen. They had glimpsed the darkest depths of the Nazi regime, and they knew that the evil that had spawned Operation Nightingale could never truly be extinguished. They returned to the prisoner of war camp, shaken but alive. They never spoke of what they had seen on the island. They knew that no one would believe them. The war eventually ended, and Strunk and Mueller were released from the prisoner of war camp. They returned to their homes, trying to rebuild their lives, but they were haunted by the memory of Operation Nightingale. They knew that the world was a dangerous place, and that there were always those who would seek to exploit the darkest aspects of human nature. Years later, Strunk received a letter. It was from a woman he had never met. The letter was short, but it contained a single chilling sentence. "They are not all dead." Strunk's blood ran cold. He knew what the letter meant. The super soldiers, some of them had survived, and they were out there somewhere. He knew that he had to do something. He had to stop them. But how? He was just one man against an army of unstoppable killing machines. He looked in the mirror, his face etched with worry. This was far from over. The first name on the list was not the one he expected. It was not a high-ranking officer. It was a name he barely recognized, a cook. A cook at the prisoner of war camp in Scotland. He remembered her vaguely. A quiet woman, always with a kind smile. What could she possibly have to do with Operation Nightingale? He looked at the next name on the list. Another seemingly insignificant person. A nurse. He remembered her too. She had been kind to him when he was sick. As he continued to read the list, he realized that all the names were of ordinary people. People who had seemed harmless, even helpful, But what was their connection to Operation Nightingale? And why were their names on this list? He suddenly remembered something: the cook. She had always been very interested in the prisoners. She always asked a lot of questions. And the nurse. She had always been very attentive, almost too attentive. Could they have been spies? Could they have been working for Dr. Schmidt? He felt a chill run down his spine. He had to find out. He had to find these people and uncover the truth. He packed a bag and left his home, determined to track down the people on the list and unravel the mystery of Operation Nightingale. His journey took him across Europe, from the bustling cities to the remote countryside. He followed every lead, interviewed every witness, piecing together the puzzle one piece at a time. He discovered that the people on the list were indeed spies. They had been working for Dr. Schmidt, gathering information, recruiting new members, and preparing for the resurgence of the Reich. But why had they been so interested in the prisoners? What was their ultimate goal? He finally found the answer in a hidden archive, a secret repository of Nazi documents. He discovered that Dr. Schmidt's plan was not just to create super soldiers. It was to create a new race of humans, a master race that would rule the world. The prisoners were not just prisoners. They were subjects. They were being experimented on, their genes being manipulated, their minds being controlled. Dr. Schmidt had been trying to create a new generation of super soldiers, soldiers who would be loyal to the Reich, soldiers who would be unstoppable. And now her plan was about to be realized. The spies had been activated, the super soldiers were being unleashed, and the world was on the brink of another war. Strunk knew that he had to stop them. He was the only one who knew the truth. He was the only one who could save the world. He gathered his allies, a small group of dedicated individuals who believed in his story. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched, but they were determined to fight. They launched a daring raid on the spies' headquarters, a hidden fortress in the mountains. They fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed by the enemy. One by one, his allies fell until only Strunk was left standing. He was surrounded by super soldiers, their eyes burning with hatred. He knew that he was about to die, but he refused to surrender. He would fight to the end, even if it meant sacrificing his own life. He charged at the super soldiers, his gun blazing. He managed to take down a few of them, but they were too many. They overwhelmed him, their blows raining down on him. He fell to the ground, his body broken and bleeding. He looked up at the super soldiers, their faces contorted with rage. He knew that this was the end, but he had no regrets. He had fought for what he believed in. He had tried to save the world. He closed his eyes, waiting for the final blow, but then something unexpected happened. A voice rang out, a voice he recognized. "Stop!" The super soldiers froze, their weapons lowered. They turned to face the speaker. It was the cook. The cook from the prisoner of war camp. She was standing at the entrance to the fortress, her eyes filled with tears. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" The super soldiers didn't answer. They just stared at her, their faces blank. "This is not what Dr. Schmidt wanted," she said. "She wanted to create a better world, a world of peace and justice." The super soldiers still didn't answer. "I know you can hear me," she said. "I know you can understand me. You are not monsters, you are human beings." She took a step forward towards the super soldiers. "Please," she said. "Stop this madness, end this war." The super soldiers hesitated. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with confusion. Then one of them lowered his weapon, then another and another, until all the super soldiers had laid down their arms. The cook smiled, her eyes filled with hope. She had done it. She had saved the world. But then something unexpected happened again. Shot rang out and the cook fell to the ground dead. The super soldiers gasped, their faces contorted with horror. They turned to face the shooter. It was the nurse from the prisoner of war camp. She was standing at the entrance to the fortress, a gun in her hand. "You fools," she said, her voice cold and emotionless. "You have betrayed the Reich. You have betrayed Dr. Schmidt." The super soldiers stared at her, their eyes filled with rage. "Kill them," she commanded, pointing at Strunk and the other survivors. "Kill them all." The super soldiers hesitated for a moment, then they turned towards their targets, their weapons raised. The battle was not over, it had just begun. But it was a battle for something far more important than territory or power. It was a battle for the very soul of humanity. As the super soldiers advanced, Strunk noticed something glinting in the snow. a small metal object half buried in the white expanse. He recognized it instantly. It was a detonator, and it was connected to the explosives that had been planted throughout the fortress. He looked at the nurse, her eyes burning with fanaticism. She was prepared to destroy everything, to sacrifice everyone for her twisted vision of the future. He knew what he had to do. He had to stop her. He had to detonate the explosives and destroy the fortress, even if it meant sacrificing himself. He reached for the detonator, his fingers trembling. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Then he pressed the button. The world exploded in a blinding flash of light. The fortress was obliterated, reduced to rubble and ash. The super soldiers, the nurse, and all the other spies were vaporized, their evil plans forever thwarted. Strunk was gone too, sacrificed for the greater good. But his sacrifice was not in vain. He had saved the world from a terrible fate. He had proven that even in the darkest of times there is always hope. The war was finally over, and the world could finally begin to heal, except a secret file had survived the blast. On it, a single sentence written in German: Project Valkyrie Stage 1 complete. The implications of this simple statement are terrifying. Was Operation Nightingale just one small cog in a much larger machine? What was Project Valkyrie? What horrors did it unleash upon the world? And more importantly, are the forces behind it still at large, waiting to strike again? If you found this story intriguing, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next thrilling exploration into the dark secrets of World War II. Let us know in the comments if you enjoyed the story, and if you have heard any compelling stories about World War Roman II/WW2 Story Project Valkyrie. The words echoed in the empty chambers of Strunk's mind, a chilling reminder that the horrors he had witnessed were merely a prelude to something far grander, far more sinister. His sacrifice had bought the world some time, perhaps, but the insidious tendrils of the Nazi regime had spread deeper than he could have ever imagined. Somewhere, someone was still pulling the strings. The prisoner of war camp in Scotland, a sprawling complex of barbed wire and drab buildings, was a world unto itself. The days bled into one another, marked only by the changing shifts of guards and the monotonous clang of the mess hall bell. Hope was a rare commodity, traded in hushed whispers and fleeting dreams of home. But for Major General Sir Alistair Humphrey, a seasoned officer with a distinguished military career, hope was a necessity. As commandant of the camp, he bore the weight of responsibility for the thousands of men under his charge. He was a man of order, of discipline, and above all, of unwavering faith in the principles of justice and humanity. One crisp autumn morning, as Humphrey conducted his routine inspection of the camp, he noticed something amiss. A young private, barely out of his teens, was trembling violently as he received his breakfast ration of porridge. It wasn't the cold. Humphrey could sense a deeper, more primal fear radiating from the boy. "Private Davies," Humphrey inquired, his voice firm but gentle, "are you unwell?" Davies flinched, his eyes darting nervously around the mess hall. "No, sir, I'm fine, sir," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. But Humphrey wasn't convinced. He had seen enough men break under pressure to recognize the signs of a troubled mind. He dismissed Davies and continued his inspection, but the image of the trembling private lingered in his thoughts. Later that day, Humphrey received a report from one of the guards detailing a peculiar incident. A group of German prisoners had been observed engaging in a strange ritual in the dead of night. Under the cloak of darkness, they had gathered in a secluded corner of the camp, chanting in low voices and making strange gestures. The guard, a young corporal named Miller, had been unable to understand the language or decipher the meaning of the ritual. He had reported the incident to his superiors, but his concerns had been dismissed as mere superstition. Humphrey, however, saw a potential connection between the ritual and the private's unsettling behavior. He decided to investigate further. He summoned Corporal Miller to his office and listened intently as the young guard recounted the details of the incident. Miller was a practical man, not prone to flights of fancy. His sincerity convinced Humphrey that something unusual was indeed happening within the camp. Humphrey tasked Miller with discreetly monitoring the German prisoners, paying particular attention to their activities and interactions. He also ordered a thorough search of the prisoners' barracks, looking for any clues that might shed light on the ritual. The search yielded nothing of immediate significance. A few crude drawings, some handwritten letters, and the usual assortment of personal belongings. But as Humphrey sifted through the confiscated items, one object caught his eye. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box, no larger than his hand. The box was locked, and there was no obvious way to open it without damaging it. Humphrey examined the box closely, his curiosity piqued. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the carvings depicting scenes of ancient Norse mythology. He couldn't shake the feeling that the box held some sort of significance, that it was more than just a decorative object. He decided to keep the box for further examination. That night, Humphrey found himself unable to sleep. The image of the trembling private and the strange ritual kept replaying in his mind. He rose from his bed and went to his study, determined to unlock the secrets of the wooden box. He spent hours poring over the box, examining every detail, searching for a hidden latch or a secret mechanism. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he discovered a small, almost imperceptible indentation on one of the carvings. He pressed the indentation, and with a soft click, the box sprang open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single object, a tarnished silver coin. The coin was unlike any he had ever seen. One side depicted the image of a Valkyrie, the mythical Norse warrior maiden who guided fallen heroes to Valhalla. The other side was engraved with a series of symbols, strange and unfamiliar. Humphrey recognized some of the runes, ancient Norse characters used for writing and divination, but the other symbols were completely unknown to him. He felt a growing sense of unease as he examined the coin. It was as if he had stumbled upon something ancient and powerful, something that should have remained hidden. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere in the prisoner of war camp grew increasingly tense. The German prisoners became more withdrawn, more secretive. The strange rituals continued, becoming more frequent and more elaborate. Private Davies' condition worsened. He became increasingly agitated, suffering from nightmares and hallucinations. He refused to eat, claiming that the food was poisoned. Humphrey tried to reassure him, to convince him that he was safe, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Davies was convinced that something terrible was about to happen, that the camp was under some sort of evil influence. Humphrey began to suspect that the prisoners were involved in something far more sinister than a simple escape plot. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were part of some larger, more dangerous game. One evening, as Humphrey was walking through the camp, he noticed a commotion near the mess hall. A crowd of prisoners had gathered around a central figure, shouting and gesticulating wildly. Humphrey pushed his way through the crowd and saw that the object of their attention was one of the cooks, a middle-aged woman named Frau Schmidt. Frau Schmidt had been working in the camp kitchen for several months. She was a quiet, unassuming woman who kept mostly to herself. But now she was standing in the middle of the mess hall, her face flushed, her eyes blazing with anger. She was shouting at the prisoners in German, her voice rising to a fever pitch. Humphrey didn't understand the language, but he could sense the intensity of her emotions. The prisoners were responding to her with a mixture of fear and defiance. Humphrey ordered the guards to disperse the crowd and bring Frau Schmidt to his office. When Frau Schmidt arrived, she was still visibly agitated. She refused to speak, her lips pressed tightly together. Humphrey tried to question her, but she remained silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. He sensed that she was hiding something, that she knew more than she was letting on. He decided to try a different approach. He showed her the silver coin he had found in the wooden box. As soon as she saw the coin, her eyes widened in surprise. She gasped and took a step back as if she had seen a ghost. Humphrey knew he had struck a nerve. "Do you recognize this?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Frau Schmidt hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Humphrey told her how he had found the coin in the wooden box. Frau Schmidt's face paled. "That box, it should never have been opened," she said, her voice trembling. Humphrey pressed her for more information, but she refused to elaborate. She clammed up again, her eyes filled with fear. He could tell that she was torn between her loyalty to whatever cause she was involved in and her fear of the consequences of revealing the truth. He decided to release her, hoping that she would eventually come to her senses and confide in him. But as she left his office, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. Whatever was happening in the camp, it was escalating quickly, and he was running out of time to stop it. That night, Private Davies was found dead in his bunk. He had apparently died of a heart attack, but Humphrey suspected foul play. He ordered a thorough autopsy, but the results were inconclusive. There was no sign of poisoning or any other physical trauma. It was as if Davies had simply died of fear. Humphrey felt a deep sense of frustration and helplessness. He was convinced that Davies' death was connected to the other strange events in the camp. But he had no proof, no evidence to support his suspicions. He was starting to feel like he was losing control of the situation. As Humphrey delved deeper into the mystery, he found himself increasingly isolated. His superiors dismissed his concerns as paranoia, chalking them up to the stress of managing a large prisoner of war camp. His own staff began to doubt his judgment, whispering behind his back. He was starting to feel like he was the only one who saw the danger, the only one who understood the gravity of the situation. But he refused to give up. He knew that something terrible was brewing in the camp, and he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. He decided to focus his investigation on Frau Schmidt. He was convinced that she held the key to the mystery. He ordered a discreet surveillance of her movements, hoping to catch her in the act of communicating with the other prisoners. But Frau Schmidt was careful. She never spoke to anyone directly, never exchanged any objects, never did anything that could be construed as suspicious. Humphrey was starting to wonder if he had misjudged her. Perhaps she was just a harmless old woman, caught up in something she didn't understand. One afternoon, as Humphrey was reviewing the surveillance reports on Frau Schmidt, he noticed something unusual. She had been seen entering the camp chapel, a small, rarely used building located on the outskirts of the compound. Humphrey knew that Frau Schmidt was not particularly religious. She had never been seen attending any of the regular church services. He decided to investigate. He walked to the chapel and quietly opened the door. Inside, he found Frau Schmidt kneeling in front of the altar, her head bowed in prayer. Humphrey hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to interrupt her, but then he noticed something glinting in her hand. It was a small, silver object, almost identical to the coin he had found in the wooden box. Humphrey stepped inside the chapel and approached Frau Schmidt. "What is that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Frau Schmidt gasped and quickly concealed the object in her hand. She turned to face Humphrey, her eyes filled with fear. "It's nothing," she said, her voice trembling. Humphrey reached out and gently took her hand. He opened her palm and saw the silver coin. It was an exact replica of the coin he had found in the wooden box. He stared at the coin, his mind racing. What did it mean? Why did Frau Schmidt have another one? "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice firm but insistent. Frau Schmidt remained silent, her lips pressed tightly together. Humphrey could see that she was terrified, but she refused to speak. He knew he was close to breaking the case, close to uncovering the truth about Operation Valkyrie. But he needed Frau Schmidt to talk. He decided to try one last tactic. He told her about Private Davies, about his death, about his fear. He told her that he believed Davies' death was connected to the coins, to the rituals, to everything that was happening in the camp. He pleaded with her to tell him the truth, to help him stop whatever evil was brewing. Frau Schmidt listened intently, her eyes filled with tears. When Humphrey finished speaking, she took a deep breath and began to talk. She told him about Project Valkyrie, about Dr. Schmidt, about the super soldiers. She told him about the Nazi plan to create a new race of humans, a master race that would rule the world. She told him that the coins were a symbol of loyalty, a mark of allegiance to the Reich. She told him that the rituals were a way of strengthening the prisoners' minds, of preparing them for their role in the New World Order. And she told him that Private Davies had discovered the truth, that he had realized what was happening in the camp. That's why they had killed him. Humphrey listened in stunned silence as Frau Schmidt revealed the horrifying details of Operation Valkyrie. He couldn't believe that such evil could exist, that such a twisted plan could be conceived. He felt a surge of anger, of revulsion, of determination to stop it. Frau Schmidt told him that the prisoners were planning to escape the camp, that they were going to rendezvous with a U-boat that was waiting for them off the coast of Scotland. They were going to take the super soldier technology to a secret base in South America, where they would continue Dr. Schmidt's work. Humphrey knew he had to act quickly. He had to stop the prisoners from escaping. He had to prevent them from unleashing their evil upon the world. He gathered his staff and laid out the situation. He told them about Project Valkyrie, about the super soldiers, about the escape plan. He ordered them to prepare for a full-scale lockdown of the camp. He ordered them to be on high alert, to be ready to use deadly force if necessary. His staff listened in stunned silence, their faces etched with disbelief. But they trusted Humphrey. They knew that he would never exaggerate or fabricate such a story. They pledged their loyalty and vowed to do everything in their power to stop the prisoners. As the guards prepared to lock down the camp, Humphrey received a disturbing report. A group of prisoners had broken into the camp armory and stolen a cache of weapons. The prisoners were armed and dangerous. The escape was already underway. Humphrey ordered his men to converge on the prisoners' barracks, to surround them and prevent them from leaving the camp. A fierce battle erupted. The prisoners fought with a desperate ferocity, their eyes burning with fanaticism. The guards fought back with equal determination, their loyalty to their country and their fear of the super soldiers fueling their courage. The battle raged for hours, the sounds of gunfire and explosions echoing through the camp. Men fell on both sides, their bodies littering the ground. As the battle reached its climax, Humphrey received another report. A group of prisoners had managed to break through the perimeter fence and were heading towards the coast. Humphrey knew that he had to stop them, that he had to prevent them from reaching the U-boat. He gathered a small group of his most trusted men and set off in pursuit. They raced through the darkness, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could hear the sounds of the prisoners ahead, their voices shouting in German. Finally, they reached the coast. They saw the prisoners gathered on the beach, waiting for the U-boat. Humphrey ordered his men to open fire. The prisoners scattered, some diving for cover, others returning fire. A fierce firefight ensued. Humphrey and his men fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The prisoners were closing in, their eyes filled with hatred. Humphrey knew that he was about to die, but he refused to give up. He would fight to the end, even if it meant sacrificing his own life. As the prisoners surrounded him, he saw something in the distance, a light on the water, the U-boat. It was almost here. He knew that if the prisoners reached the U-boat, all would be lost. He had to do something. He had to stop them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver coin. He looked at it for a moment, remembering Frau Schmidt's words, remembering Dr. Schmidt's plan. He knew what he had to do. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Then he threw the coin into the air. As the coin spun through the air, it caught the light of the moon. The light reflected off the coin and onto the faces of the prisoners. The prisoners froze, their eyes widening in surprise. They stared at the coin, their faces contorted with confusion. Then one of them screamed. He clutched his head and fell to the ground, writhing in pain. Another prisoner screamed, and another. Soon all the prisoners were screaming, their bodies convulsing uncontrollably. Humphrey watched in amazement as the prisoners succumbed to the power of the coin. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew that it was working. The prisoners were no longer a threat. The U-boat, seeing the chaos on the beach, turned away and disappeared into the darkness. The escape had been thwarted. The prisoners were defeated. Humphrey had saved the world. But as he stood on the beach, surrounded by the writhing bodies of the prisoners, he felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that he had only won a battle, not the war. Project Valkyrie was still out there somewhere, and the forces behind it were still at large, waiting to strike again. He looked out at the dark sea, his mind filled with foreboding. He knew that his journey was far from over. Back at the prisoner of war camp, order was slowly restored. The surviving prisoners were rounded up and confined to their barracks. The dead were buried. The wounded were treated. But the atmosphere in the camp remained tense. The guards were on edge, their nerves frayed. They knew that they had narrowly averted a catastrophe, but they also knew that the danger was far from over. Major General Sir Alistair Humphrey summoned his senior officers to his office for an emergency meeting. He laid out the situation, explaining the details of Project Valkyrie and the escape attempt. He stressed the importance of remaining vigilant, of being prepared for any eventuality. As the meeting drew to a close, Humphrey revealed a piece of information that he had been withholding. He told them about the secret file he had found, the file that mentioned Project Valkyrie, Stage 1, complete. He explained that he didn't know what Stage 1 entailed, but he suspected that it was something far more sinister than anything they had yet encountered. He tasked his officers with investigating the file, with uncovering the truth about Project Valkyrie, Stage 1. He ordered them to leave no stone unturned, to spare no expense. He knew that the fate of the world might depend on it. As his officers filed out of the room, Humphrey sat alone in his office, staring at the silver coin. He felt a deep sense of unease, a premonition of impending doom. He knew that the storm was coming, and he knew that he had to be ready. Meanwhile, in a remote corner of the prisoner of war camp, a young nurse named Elsa Schmidt was tending to the wounded. Elsa was a kind and compassionate woman who had dedicated her life to helping others. She had been working at the camp for several months, providing medical care to both the prisoners and the guards. She was well liked by everyone, respected for her professionalism and her unwavering dedication. But Elsa was hiding a secret. She was a spy, working for the Nazi regime. She had been sent to the camp to gather information about Operation Valkyrie and to assist the prisoners in their escape. She had been the one who had provided the prisoners with the weapons, the one who had helped them break through the perimeter fence. She had been the one who had shot the cook, Frau Schmidt, when she had tried to stop the escape. Elsa was a true believer in the Nazi ideology. She believed that the Aryan race was superior to all others, that Germany was destined to rule the world. She was willing to do anything, to sacrifice anything, to achieve that goal. As she tended to the wounded, she couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment. The escape had failed. The prisoners had been defeated. Her mission had been compromised, but she refused to give up. She knew that she had to continue fighting, that she had to find a way to salvage the situation. She glanced around the infirmary, her eyes scanning the faces of the wounded. She noticed a young prisoner lying unconscious on a cot. He was badly injured, his body covered in blood. Elsa recognized him. He was one of the leaders of the escape attempt. She approached his cot and leaned over him, her eyes filled with a sinister glint. She had a plan, and it was about to be put into action. The next morning, Major General Sir Alistair Humphrey awoke with a start. He had been plagued by nightmares all night, visions of super soldiers and twisted experiments. He rose from his bed and went to his study, determined to put the nightmares behind him. He sat down at his desk and began to review the reports from his officers. They had made some progress in their investigation of the secret file. They had discovered that Project Valkyrie, Stage 1, involved the creation of a network of sleeper cells throughout the world. These sleeper cells were composed of ordinary people who had been brainwashed and programmed to carry out specific missions. They were activated by a trigger phrase, a code word that would unlock their hidden programming. The prisoners at the camp had been part of one of these sleeper cells. They had been activated by the silver coin, which had triggered their escape attempt. Humphrey realized that the world was in far greater danger than he had ever imagined. There were sleeper cells everywhere, waiting to be activated. Anyone could be a spy, a traitor, a potential killer. He had to find a way to identify these sleeper cells, to deactivate them before they could carry out their missions. He tasked his officers with developing a plan to identify and neutralize the sleeper cells. He ordered them to work around the clock, to spare no effort. The fate of the world depended on it. As he was reviewing the reports, Humphrey received a phone call. It was from the camp infirmary. The nurse, Elsa Schmidt, was on the line. She told him that the wounded prisoner, the leader of the escape attempt, had regained consciousness. She said that he was asking to speak to Humphrey. Humphrey was suspicious. Why would the prisoner want to speak to him? What could he possibly have to say? But he decided to go to the infirmary anyway. He knew that he couldn't afford to ignore any potential lead. He arrived at the infirmary and was led to the prisoner's bedside. The prisoner was lying on the cot, his face pale and gaunt. He looked up at Humphrey, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and defiance. "You wanted to speak to me?" Humphrey asked, his voice cautious. The prisoner nodded slowly. "I have information," he said, his voice weak but clear. "Information about Project Valkyrie." Humphrey leaned closer, his senses on high alert. "What kind of information?" he asked. The prisoner hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "The trigger phrase," he said. "I know the trigger phrase." Humphrey's heart skipped a beat. The trigger phrase was the key to deactivating the sleeper cells. If he could get the prisoner to reveal the trigger phrase, he could save countless lives. "Tell me," he said, his voice urgent. "Tell me the trigger phrase." The prisoner looked at him, his eyes filled with a strange expression. "I will tell you," he said. "But first you must promise me something." "What is it?" Humphrey asked, his patience wearing thin. "You must promise me that you will use this information to destroy Project Valkyrie," the prisoner said. "You must promise me that you will stop the Nazis from creating their master race." Humphrey looked at the prisoner, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I promise," he said. "I promise you that I will do everything in my power to destroy Project Valkyrie." The prisoner nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "The trigger phrase is—" He paused for a moment, his eyes closing. Then he spoke the words, his voice barely audible. "The nightingale sings." Humphrey stared at the prisoner, his mind racing. "The nightingale sings," he repeated, testing the words on his tongue. He felt a shiver run down his spine. The words sounded familiar, ominous. He couldn't quite place them, but he knew that they were significant. "What does it mean?" he asked the prisoner. The prisoner smiled weakly. "It means the end," he said, and with that he closed his eyes and died. Humphrey stood there for a moment, staring at the dead prisoner. He felt a sense of triumph, of relief. He had the trigger phrase. He could stop the sleeper cells. He could save the world. But he also felt a sense of unease, a premonition of impending doom. He knew that the battle was far from over. As he turned to leave the infirmary, he noticed Elsa Schmidt standing in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. She had overheard everything, and now she knew that her mission had failed. Humphrey looked at her, his eyes filled with suspicion. He knew that she was a spy. He knew that she was working for the Nazis, but he didn't know what role she had played in Operation Valkyrie. He decided to confront her. "Elsa," he said, his voice firm but gentle, "I know who you are, I know what you've done." Elsa looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. She didn't say a word. "Tell me," Humphrey said. "Tell me everything. Tell me about Operation Valkyrie. Tell me about the sleeper cells. Tell me about the trigger phrase." Elsa hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Very well," she said. "I will tell you everything." She began to air Yeruvate, her voice low and trembling. She told him about her past, about her upbringing in Nazi Germany, about her unwavering belief in the Nazi ideology. She told him about her recruitment into the spy network, about her mission to infiltrate the prisoner of war camp. She told him about her role in assisting the prisoner's escape attempt, about her betrayal of Frau Schmidt. And she told him about her knowledge of Operation Valkyrie, about the sleeper cells, about the trigger phrase. As she spoke, Humphrey listened intently, his mind racing. He realized that Elsa was a true believer, a fanatic who was willing to die for her cause. But he also sensed that she was conflicted, that she was starting to doubt her beliefs. He decided to try to appeal to her humanity, to try to convince her that she was on the wrong side. "Elsa," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "Good person, you're a kind and compassionate woman. You've dedicated your life to helping others. How can you reconcile that with the evil that you've been involved in?" Elsa looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know what to believe anymore." Humphrey reached out and took her hand. "It's not too late to change," he said. "It's not too late to do the right thing. Help me stop Operation Valkyrie. Help me save the world." Elsa looked at him, her eyes filled with hope. "What can I do?" she asked. "Tell me everything you know," Humphrey said. "Tell me about the sleeper cells. Tell me about their missions. Tell me how to deactivate them." Elsa nodded slowly. "I will," she said. "I will tell you everything." She began to speak, revealing the secrets of Operation Valkyrie one by one. As she spoke, Humphrey listened intently, his mind racing. He knew that he was running out of time. The sleeper cells were out there waiting to be activated, and he had to stop them before it was too late. But what he didn't know was that Elsa was still hiding something, something that could change everything. As Humphrey continued to interrogate Elsa, he began to notice a pattern in her answers. She was providing him with accurate information about the sleeper cells, but she was omitting certain details, withholding crucial pieces of the puzzle. He sensed that she was still protecting someone, still loyal to the Nazi cause. "Elsa," he said, his voice firm but gentle, "you're not telling me everything, you're still hiding something." Elsa looked at him, her eyes filled with fear. She didn't say a word. "Who are you protecting?" Humphrey asked. "Who is still involved in Operation Valkyrie?" Elsa hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I can't tell you," she said. "It's too dangerous." "Dangerous for whom?" Humphrey asked. Elsa remained silent. Humphrey realized that she was protecting someone close to her, someone who was deeply involved in Operation Valkyrie. He decided to change his approach. He told her about his family, about his wife and children. He told her about his hopes for the future, about his desire for a world of peace and justice. He told her that he couldn't achieve that future without her help. He pleaded with her to tell him the truth, to trust him with her secret. Elsa listened intently, her eyes filled with tears. When Humphrey finished speaking, she took a deep breath and began to talk. She told him about her brother, Wilhelm Schmidt. Wilhelm was a brilliant scientist, a protege of Dr. Elizabeth Schmidt. He had been deeply involved in the research and development of the super-soldier technology. After Dr. Schmidt's death, Wilhelm had taken over the leadership of Operation Valkyrie. He was now in charge of the sleeper cells, responsible for activating them and directing their missions. Humphrey stared at Elsa, his mind reeling. Wilhelm Schmidt, the brother of the woman he had been interrogating, the leader of Operation Valkyrie. He couldn't believe it. "Where is he now?" he asked, his voice urgent. "I don't know," Elsa said. "He disappeared after the escape attempt failed. I haven't heard from him since." Humphrey knew that he had to find Wilhelm Schmidt. He was the key to stopping Operation Valkyrie. He was the only one who could deactivate the sleeper cells. He ordered his officers to launch a worldwide manhunt for Wilhelm Schmidt. He ordered them to use every resource at their disposal, to spare no expense. The fate of the world depended on it. As the manhunt got underway, Humphrey continued to interrogate Elsa. He wanted to know everything about Wilhelm, everything about Operation Valkyrie. He learned that Wilhelm was obsessed with his mother's work, that he was determined to carry on her legacy. He learned that Wilhelm believed that the Aryan race was destined to rule the world, that he was willing to do anything to achieve that goal. He learned that Wilhelm had a secret hideout, a remote castle in the Scottish Highlands. The castle had been used by the Nazis during the war as a base for espionage operations. It was rumored to be filled with secret passages and hidden chambers. Humphrey realized that Wilhelm might be hiding in the castle. He decided to lead a team of soldiers to the castle to search for Wilhelm. He knew that it was a long shot, but he had nothing to lose. He gathered his men and set off for the Scottish Highlands, determined to capture Wilhelm Schmidt and put an end to Operation Valkyrie once and for all. As Humphrey and his men made their way to the castle, they were unaware that they were being watched. Wilhelm Schmidt was hiding in the shadows, observing their every move. He knew that they were coming for him. He knew that his time was running out, but he was not afraid. He had a plan that would ensure the success of Operation Valkyrie, even if it meant sacrificing himself. He smiled grimly and disappeared into the darkness, ready to unleash his final, devastating move. Humphrey and his men arrived at the castle under the cover of darkness. The castle was an imposing structure, perched atop a craggy hill. It was surrounded by a dense forest, making it difficult to approach undetected. Humphrey ordered his men to surround the castle and secure the perimeter. He then led a small team inside, determined to search every room, every corridor, every hidden chamber. The castle was eerily silent, as if it had been abandoned for decades. The air was cold and damp, filled with the smell of mildew and decay. As they made their way through the castle, Humphrey and his men found evidence of recent occupation. There were empty food containers, discarded cigarette butts, and signs of hasty cleaning. It was clear that Wilhelm Schmidt had been here, but he was no longer present. Humphrey felt a sense of frustration and disappointment. He had come so close to capturing Wilhelm, but he had slipped through his fingers. He was about to order his men to abandon the search when he noticed something unusual. A faint draft was coming from a wall in one of the rooms. He approached the wall and examined it closely. He discovered a small, almost imperceptible crack in the stone. He pressed on the crack, and with a soft click, a section of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden passage. Humphrey's heart skipped a beat. He had found Wilhelm's secret hideout. He gathered his men and cautiously entered the passage. The passage was narrow and dark, winding its way deep into the bowels of the castle. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. As they moved deeper into the passage, they began to hear a faint sound, a rhythmic clicking like the sound of a ticking clock. Humphrey ordered his men to stop. He listened intently, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The sound was getting louder, closer. Suddenly, the passage ahead of them was illuminated by a bright light. Humphrey and his men shielded their eyes, waiting for their vision to adjust. As their eyes adjusted, they saw what was ahead of them. It was a large chamber, filled with strange equipment and flashing lights. In the center of the chamber, standing in front of a control panel, was Wilhelm Schmidt. He was wearing a lab coat and his face was illuminated by the glow of the equipment. He looked up at Humphrey and smiled grimly. "Welcome, Major General," he said. "I've been expecting you." Humphrey stared at Wilhelm, his mind racing. He had found him. He had finally found the leader of Operation Valkyrie, but something was wrong. Wilhelm seemed too calm, too confident. He was as if he had been expecting them all along. "What is this place?" Humphrey asked, his voice cautious. "This," Wilhelm said, "is my laboratory, the place where I will complete my mother's work." He gestured to the equipment in the chamber. "I have perfected the super soldier technology. I have created a new generation of warriors, loyal to the Reich, unstoppable in battle." Humphrey felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that Wilhelm was insane, that he was willing to do anything to achieve his twisted vision of the future. "What are you planning to do?" Humphrey asked. Wilhelm smiled grimly. "I'm planning to unleash my warriors upon the world," he said. "I am planning to start a new war, a war that will end with the triumph of the Aryan race." He pressed a button on the control panel, and it all starts now. Suddenly the chamber was filled with a deafening siren. The equipment began to hum and the lights flickered and died. The chamber plunged into darkness. Humphrey and his men were caught off guard. They stumbled around in the darkness, trying to regain their bearings. Then they heard a sound. A shuffling, scraping sound coming from the shadows. Humphrey ordered his men to draw their weapons. They pointed their guns into the darkness, waiting for whatever was coming. The shuffling sound grew louder, closer. Then figures began to emerge from the shadows. They were tall, muscular men wearing German uniforms. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes burning with a strange light. They were the super soldiers, Wilhelm Schmidt's new generation of warriors. The super soldiers charged towards Humphrey and his men, their movements swift and deadly. A fierce battle erupted in the darkness. Humphrey and his men fought bravely, but they were no match for the super soldiers. The super soldiers were stronger, faster, and more resilient than any human being. They moved with inhuman speed and agility, dodging bullets and overpowering their opponents. One by one, Humphrey's men fell, their bodies broken and bleeding. Humphrey watched in horror as his men were slaughtered by the super soldiers. He knew that he was next. He was about to be killed by the very monsters he had been trying to stop. He closed his eyes, waiting for the end. But then he heard a voice that he recognized. "Stop!" The super soldiers froze, their movements ceasing. They turned to face the speaker. It was Elsa Schmidt. She was standing at the entrance to the chamber, her face pale and her eyes filled with tears. "Wilhelm," she said, her voice trembling. "What are you doing? This is madness." Wilhelm looked at her, his eyes filled with rage. "You traitor," he said. "You have betrayed the Reich." "No, Wilhelm," Elsa said. "I have not betrayed the Reich. I have betrayed you. I have realized that what you are doing is wrong. You are destroying everything that our mother stood for." "Our mother would be proud of me," Wilhelm said. "I am carrying on her legacy. I am creating a new world order, a world where the Aryan race will rule." "No, Wilhelm," Elsa said. "Our mother would be ashamed of you. She wanted to create a better world, not a world of hatred and violence." "Silence!" Wilhelm shouted. He raised his hand and pointed at Elsa. "Kill her! he commanded the super soldiers. The super soldiers hesitated for a moment, then turned towards Elsa, their weapons raised. Humphrey watched in horror as the super soldiers prepared to execute Elsa. He knew that he had to do something. He had to save her, even if it meant sacrificing himself. He lunged towards Wilhelm, intending to stop him from giving the order, but Wilhelm was too quick. He sidestepped Humphrey's attack and grabbed a gun from one of the super soldiers. He pointed the gun at Humphrey and fired. The bullet struck Humphrey in the chest, sending him reeling backwards. He fell to the ground, his body racked with pain. He looked up at Wilhelm, his eyes filled with hatred. "You won't win," he said, his voice weak but clear. "Operation Valkyrie will fail." Wilhelm smiled grimly. "We shall see," he said. He turned back to the super soldiers and repeated his order. "Kill her." The super soldiers raised their weapons and prepared to fire. But then something unexpected happened. Elsa lunged forward, grabbing a grenade from one of the super soldiers' belts. She pulled the pin and held the grenade aloft. "I'm sorry, Wilhelm,"